It's not often that we get to open a WarFronts video with a nod to the Smiths, but stop me if you think you've heard this one before. Ethiopia and Eritrea are on the brink of war. Quoting Nosmod Kabaramosi, the writer of Foreign Policy's weekly Africa brief, Ethiopian and Eritrean leaders have traded hostile rhetoric in recent weeks, triggering international fears of a fresh regional conflict. Now, these fears are hardly new. Talk of war between the two first surfaced in late 2023, and we covered those fears as recently as August, when the weather was nice, and when the warning signs went from merely blinking to flashing bright red with klaxon sounding. Those August warnings ultimately subsided without either side escalating into open conflict. This time, however, the warning signs feel more ominous. All over Eritrea, the government has been ramping up its conscription drive with soldiers going door-to-door looking for young recruits and draft dodgers. Across the border, the Ethiopian foreign minister wrote to the UN Secretary-General on the 2nd of October accusing Eritrea of funding and directing armed groups in the Amhara region to destabilize Addis Ababa. Beyond that, Prime Minister Abiy has continued to insist that Ethiopia will have access to the sea, access that could only be granted by annexing part of Eritrea. So in other words, neither side sounds like they are preparing for a peaceful Sunday brunch with bottomless mimosas. Which sounds lovely. For regional observers, all the kindling is there to start another catastrophic war, and it's growing larger with each passing day. So, will it get to that point? Is a war between the two nations inevitable? And perhaps most importantly, what can the international community do to prevent the situation from escalating further? Is war inevitable? Okay, let's start with the most important question of all. Is a war between Eritrea and Ethiopia inevitable? According to Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, no, it isn't. During a speech in Parliament, he said, and we'll quote him here, "We have no intention of going to war. Rather, we firmly believe the issue can be resolved peacefully." And while taking a war criminal at his word might seem a bit naive, the good news is that most regional experts do seem to agree. Professor Cleonardo Raleigh, the president and CEO of the Armed Conflict and Location Event Data Project, better known as ACLED, wrote, and we'll quote her here, "A direct confrontation between Ethiopia and Eritrea is unlikely despite the threat of military action in both countries." René Lefort, an observer of Ethiopian politics since the 1970s, wrote on the local Ethiopian outlet, the Addis Standard, quoting again, "Many argue that another large-scale conflict is inevitable, while future escalation cannot be ruled out entirely. A full-blown war in the immediate term remains unlikely." For most analysts, the reason why a full-scale war isn't inevitable is simple. First, according to Lefort, the Ethiopian government is already stretched thin fighting insurgencies in Oromia and Amhara, and it can't afford to open up a new front. In Amhara, more than 3,000 government soldiers were reportedly killed as part of Operation Arbegna Adem Ali, a recent military campaign launched by the Fano insurgents. Now, while these numbers haven't been independently verified and are inherently biased because they were provided by the Fano, they do illustrate the scale of the fighting happening in the region and why Addis Ababa might feel uncomfortable drawing soldiers away to fight Asmara. Second, even if Ethiopia could quell all of the insurgencies happening within its own borders and marshal all its troops to face Asmara, victory is still not guaranteed. The last time Ethiopia and Eritrea fought an all-out war was in 1998, and Ethiopia failed to seize the port of Assab, a mere 60 kilometers from the border, despite having air superiority and a nation that was mostly at peace. If the same happens again, it will be a major blow to Abiy Ahmed and his military, especially given that Ethiopia is the larger and more economically powerful country. And you might think that all the headwinds that Ethiopia is facing would give Eritrea the advantage, but Asmara has its own problems. As a former recruit told Dr. Mohamed Kier Omer, a researcher writing for New Lines magazine, Asmara has ramped up its conscription drive, which indicates that the country is in the throes of a dire manpower crisis. According to Human Rights Watch, desertion is common in the Eritrean army, which uses a forced conscription model, and as a result, the government has resorted to punishing the families of those who flee in an attempt at deterrence. But even that hasn't stopped the exodus, which means Eritrea's military readiness and morale is questionable at best. And finally, there's the fact that Ethiopia and Eritrea aren't sure where international support would fall if a war were to break out. Ethiopia can probably rely on the UAE to support it because Abu Dhabi has been a long-time backer of Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed. The UAE supports Abiy not just because it loves sticking its oar into East African conflicts, such as by supporting the genocidal RSF in Sudan's civil war, but because Abiy's goal of getting Ethiopia a port on the Red Sea dovetails with the Emirates' goal of becoming the dominant maritime power in the region. According to Michael Waldmariam, the PhD program director at the University of Maryland School of Public Policy, in a piece for Foreign Policy, if the UAE gets involved on Ethiopia's side, Egypt and the Sudanese Armed Forces, or SAF, would probably intervene on Eritrea's side to prevent the UAE from establishing an even stronger foothold in the region. We keep insisting on probably because it isn't a guarantee that regional powers would intervene. The Sudanese conflict has transformed into a grueling statement after the fall of al-Fasher to the Paramilitary Rapid Support Forces, or RSF, and no one is sure which side will emerge victorious. So it's unclear whether the SAF would be willing to commit precious troops and equipment to another war. Additionally, there's the question of optics, particularly for the UAE. After the fall of al-Fasher and the subsequent genocide that, lest we forget, resulted in bloodstains so large they were visible from space, the UAE faced intense international scrutiny for its backing of the RSF. Getting involved in another Horn of Africa conflict, especially one where the humanitarian costs could rival or exceed those of Sudan, would be a PR nightmare that even Abu Dhabi's sophisticated lobbying apparatus might struggle to contain. The US also plays a part in any calculus on whether to go to war or not. Waldmariam notes that both Ethiopia and Eritrea are racing to repair bilateral ties with Washington. However, these have their own hurdles to overcome. For Ethiopia, it's the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. The first Trump administration considered withholding some aid to Ethiopia over the dam's construction as a pressure tactic to resolve the feud between Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt over the dam. Eritrea, on the other hand, has a much deeper diplomatic hole to dig itself out of, as decades of anti-US sentiments mean that it has few friends in Washington that it can rely on to push its agenda. However, a source that spoke to New Lines magazine said that there were Saudi-mediated talks between Washington and Asmara, and given Saudi Arabia's close ties to the Trump administration, Eritrea might have found a back channel to American influence. If Riyadh can successfully position itself as a broker between Eritrea and the US, it could shift the entire regional balance of power and potentially give Asmara the diplomatic cover it needs to take a harder line against Ethiopia. And we have to stress here that this is a big if. Other than the source that spoke to New Lines, we couldn't find any other mentions of a Saudi-mediated back-channel communication between Washington and Amhara. This isn't to say that they don't exist, just that if they do, they are being kept remarkably quiet. And in a region where even minor diplomatic moves tend to leak as a way to protect influence, that suggests either an impressive level of discipline or that the talks aren't as substantial as suggested. So, with all these reasons why a full-scale war isn't likely to break out, you might reasonably ask, well, why are you making a video about it? If conflict would be so costly for both sides as to be suicidal, surely there is no need to worry, right? Well, sadly, we don't live in an era of common sense, do we? If we did, we wouldn't have seen Russia sacrifice hundreds of thousands of men to secure minor gains in the Donbass. We wouldn't have seen Hamas launch a brutal attack on Israel that they must have known would end in the destruction of Gaza. Wouldn't have seen two Sudanese generals turn their own nation into a burnt-out hellscape in the pursuit of power. And now the fear is that good strategic sense won't be enough to restrain Ethiopia and Eritrea either. A proxy war. For regional experts, there's one very good reason to worry that war may be on the horizon. According to a retired Ethiopian general who spoke to Dr. Mohamed Kia Omar on the condition of anonymity, it's because both Abiy Ahmed and Isaias Afwerki, president of Eritrea, want a war. Quoting him here, both Abiy and Isaias want war, but their own limits trap them. That would explain the contradictions that we're seeing. Prime Minister Abiy insists that he wants peace, yet his army chief of staff made one of the most provocative statements of the conflict recently, saying, quoting, "Today we are 130 million of us. In 25 years we will be 200 million, and 2 million people cannot determine the fate of those." This is a reference to the fact that Ethiopia's population is orders of magnitude larger than Eritrea's. In other words, if we decide we want a port, we're numerous enough to just take it from you. At this point, we should take care to note that this isn't pure warmongering and that Ethiopia does have some historical claims to the port of Assab. One of the conditions of Eritrean independence, which took effect in the early 1990s, was that Addis Ababa would retain access to the port. This, though, was rescinded during the 1998 war we mentioned, and Ethiopia hasn't been allowed access since. Not that this historic claim makes it any less nauseating to see Addis Ababa banging the war drum, the drum that Eritrea is also beating with all the explosive fury of a musician trying out for Spinal Tap. Eritrea keeps denouncing Ethiopian aggression, but at the same time it's ramping up its conscriptions, and the Eritrean army is making its own aggressive remarks. According to the BBC, the Eritrean army warned Ethiopian leaders against leading their country into a quagmire, saying, and we'll quote them here, "The fate of anyone crossing the red line is plunging into an abyss from which they will never have a second chance to learn." Now, that's an admirably mixed metaphor, almost up there with Zab Brannigan declaring, "If we hit that bullseye, the rest of the dominoes should fall like a house of cards." But you know what else it is? It's a clear and very unmixed threat. However, as the retired general noted, while both leaders might want a war, they are very cognizant of their own limits. So, if we won't see a full-scale war, what's the most likely outcome here? Most analysts believe that in place of a full-scale war, we're likely to see a proxy war in the Tigray region, the northern Ethiopian province that borders Eritrea and was the scene of its own horrific civil war between 2020 and 2022, a civil war that saw Ethiopia and Eritrea put aside their differences to jointly invade, resulting in the deaths of perhaps 600,000 people and what were likely the worst war crimes of the decade prior to the fall of al-Fasher. It also ended with an awkward peace deal, one in which the Tigrayans and Ethiopia's federal government agreed to end hostilities, but then excluded Eritrea from the talks, a big contributor to the tensions that we are now seeing. As to what a new proxy war in Tigray would look like, well, that's up for debate. But most analysts agree that it would most likely see factions of the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front, the TPLF, the armed group that fought against both Addis Ababa and Asmara in 2020, side with Eritrea against the Ethiopian government. If the idea of the TPLF siding with Eritrea sounds a bit like a head-scratcher, given that just a few short years ago they were on opposing sides of a brutal war, it makes perfect sense when you remember this simple fact: the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Despite the war ending with a peace deal, the TPLF and Addis Ababa are far from being considered friends. And speaking of common enemies, there's also the risk, as noted in our October video on the Amhara insurgency, that the various separate armed groups within Ethiopia form a united front against Addis Ababa. At the same time, we mentioned that this is the worst-case scenario and that there are no guarantees that it would happen. And let's be frank that such a coalition would never cover all of Ethiopia's armed groups. The idea of the Amhara and the Oromo militias putting aside their differences is even wilder than the Tigrayans and the Eritreans making common cause. However, if the TPLF side with Asmara, and Addis Ababa has already accused Eritrea of funding the Fano rebels in Amhara, it might mean that Abiy's government ends up facing a coordinated multi-front insurgency. An insurgency in which achieving its goal of overthrowing the government would immediately lead to another round of fighting between any forces left standing. If events do go down the route of such a proxy war, and the worst-case scenario materializes, it risks becoming an even messier conflict than what we saw from 2020 to 2022. So, big question: is there a way to avoid this? A way out. Well, according to Ahmed Solomon and Dr. Abel Demisi, research fellows at Chatham House's Africa program, de-escalation is urgently needed to prevent Ethiopia and Eritrea from going to war. And that is easier said than done, since any agreement to de-escalate will require a lot of mediation. Because on Ethiopia's end, it might mean difficult concessions like looking away from the port of Assab to fulfill its growing maritime demands in other ports that come with a lot less geopolitical baggage, such as Lamu in Kenya or exploring Djibouti's proposal for a controlled port. For Eritrea, on the other hand, it means accepting that Ethiopia's quest for sea access isn't going away anytime soon, and that stonewalling only increases the chances of the very military confrontation Asmara claims it wants to avoid. According to Abdurrahman Saeed, a UK-based expert on the Horn of Africa, speaking with DW, the African Union, or AU, would be the right body to mediate this conflict. However, they have a legacy of failure that makes it difficult for any nation to trust them. He told the outlet, quoting, "The African Union has always had a chronic problem when it came to addressing issues of conflict within Africa, but also within Ethiopia too." End quote. If the African Union is unable to de-escalate the conflict, then according to Old Mariam, it might fall to the US to address it. In his view, the Trump administration could pressure both sides into making concessions since both Ethiopia and Eritrea are interested in improving ties with Washington. Ward Mariam writes in Foreign Policy that it doesn't matter who brings both sides to the table, the only thing that matters is that we avoid a war. Quoting him here, whatever the formula for de-escalation, the bottom line is that the Horn of Africa and the world cannot afford another Eritrea-Ethiopia war. It would further destabilize a region already racked by a constellation of devastating conflicts from Sudan to Somalia, and it would take generations for the region and its people to recover. Will that be enough to prevent a catastrophe? Well, we certainly hope so, but who can say? After all, in this era of disintegrating international norms and the rise of might makes right, it's depressingly common to see two powers deciding that the only way to settle their differences is on the battlefield. Thank you for watching.